I was 28 when my father died, and I thought I knew everything about him. He was a traveling salesman who worked hard to provide for our family, a loving husband to my mother, and the man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework every night he was home. But 3 weeks after his funeral, a woman named Linda called our house and said 4 words that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. I was his wife too. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I discovered that my father had been living a complete double life for over 30 years, maintaining 2 separate families in 2 different states, and how that discovery changed everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the man I had called Dad my entire life. My father, David Chen, worked as a regional sales representative for a medical equipment company, which meant he traveled 3 weeks out of every month throughout the Pacific Northwest. Growing up in Seattle, I was used to him being gone most of the time, but when he was home, he was completely present, helping with school projects, attending my soccer games, and spending quality time with my mother and me in ways that made his absences feel worth it. Dad was the kind of father who remembered every detail about my life. He knew the names of my teachers, my best friends, and my biggest fears. When I was 8 and scared of the dark, he installed a nightlight that projected stars on my ceiling and told me stories about constellations until I fell asleep. When I was 13 and dealing with bullies at school, he taught me confidence techniques and role-played difficult conversations until I felt strong enough to stand up for myself. Our family had a routine that I cherished. Dad would usually leave on Monday mornings, driving his company car loaded with medical equipment samples to hospitals and clinics throughout Oregon, Washington, and sometimes Northern California. He'd call every night at exactly 7 p.m. to talk to my mother and me about our days, asking detailed questions about school, my friends, and whatever was happening in our lives. Thursday nights were special because that's when Dad would drive home, usually arriving around 9 p.m. with small gifts, a book I'd mentioned wanting, my favorite candy from a gas station he'd stopped at, or sometimes just wildflowers he'd picked along the highway. Friday through Sunday were family time, and Dad made sure we did something special together every weekend, whether it was hiking in the mountains, visiting museums, or just cooking elaborate dinners together. My mother, Susan, had met Dad in college when they were both studying business. She always told the story of how he'd pursued her for 3 months before she agreed to go on a date with him, and how he'd won her over with his persistence, humor, and genuine kindness. They'd been married for 32 years when he died, and I'd never seen them fight in any serious way or heard my mother express any doubts about their relationship. Dad was 58 when he died suddenly of a heart attack during one of his business trips to Portland. The call came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday from a hospital administrator who had found our contact information in Dad's wallet. He'd collapsed in the lobby of a Marriott hotel where he'd been staying, and despite the efforts of paramedics and emergency room doctors, they hadn't been able to save him. The shock was devastating for my mother and me. Dad had been in good health, exercised regularly, and had no history of heart problems. The sudden loss felt surreal, like something that happened to other families but couldn't possibly be happening to ours. We'd talked to him just 6 hours before his death during his usual 7 p.m. call, and he'd seemed happy and healthy, excited about coming home the next day. Planning the funeral was difficult, but we found comfort in the process of celebrating Dad's life and sharing memories with the people who had known and loved him. Colleagues from his company drove up from Portland to attend the service. Neighbors who had known our family for years shared stories about Dad's kindness and generosity, and extended relatives traveled from across the country to pay their respects. The funeral was held at our church, where Dad had served as a volunteer coordinator for community service projects. Pastor Williams, who had known our family for 15 years, delivered a beautiful eulogy about Dad's commitment to service, his love for his family, and his reputation as someone who could always be counted on to help others. Over 200 people attended, and the sanctuary was filled with flowers and condolences from people whose lives Dad had touched. After the funeral, our house was filled with family and friends sharing memories and offering support. Dad's boss, Mr. Peterson, told stories about Dad's dedication to his work and his reputation as one of the company's most trusted and reliable employees. Our neighbors talked about how Dad had always been willing to help with yard work, home repairs, or any project that required an extra pair of hands. My college roommate, who had known Dad since I was 18, talked about how he'd always made her feel welcome in our home and how he'd remembered details about her life that even her own parents sometimes forgot. My mother's sister shared memories of family holidays and how Dad had always gone out of his way to make celebrations special for everyone, especially the children. For 3 weeks after the funeral, we lived in a cocoon of grief and support from our community. People brought meals, helped with household tasks, and provided the kind of care that helps families begin the healing process after losing someone central to their lives. My mother and I spent hours looking through photo albums, sharing memories, and trying to process the loss of someone who had been the foundation of our family. But all of that changed with a single phone call that would shatter everything we thought we knew about the man we had loved and mourned. I was at work when my mother called me 3 weeks after the funeral, crying so hard that I could barely understand what she was saying. She kept repeating, "Sarah, you need to come home right now. There's a woman here who says she was married to your father. She says they have children together. I don't understand what's happening." I thought my mother was having some kind of breakdown from grief. The idea that my father could have had another family seemed impossible. He loved us. He was devoted to my mother. He would never have betrayed our family like that. But when I got home 30 minutes later and saw the woman sitting in our living room with documents and photographs spread across our coffee table, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my father's life was about to be destroyed. Linda Martinez was 52 years old, attractive in a natural way that reminded me of my mother, and she spoke about my father with the same kind of love and familiarity that I had always associated with my mother's relationship with him. She had driven 8 hours from Portland after seeing his obituary online, and she was confused and upset about why it only mentioned one wife and one daughter when she had been married to David for 25 years and they had 2 children together. "I don't understand," Linda said, her voice shaking as she looked between my mother and me. "David told me you were business associates. He said he traveled to Seattle for work but that he didn't have family here. When I saw the obituary mentioning a wife named Susan and a daughter named Sarah, I thought there had been some mistake." The documents Linda brought with her were undeniable and devastating. A marriage certificate dated June 15, 1998, showing David Chen married to Linda Martinez in Portland, Oregon. This was 2 years after my parents had renewed their vows for their 20th anniversary in a beautiful ceremony that I had helped plan and that I thought represented their deep love and commitment to each other. Birth certificates for Michael David Martinez, age 22, and Jessica Maria Martinez, age 19, both listing David Chen as their father. The addresses on these documents were from a house in an upscale Portland neighborhood that I had never heard my father mention. There were insurance policies, bank account statements, and legal documents that showed a completely separate financial life that my mother and I had never known existed. But the photographs were what really destroyed me. Linda had brought a photo album filled with pictures of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations, and everyday moments with a man who looked exactly like my father but was living a completely different life with completely different people. There were pictures of Dad pushing Michael on a swing set, helping Jessica with what appeared to be a science project, and dancing with Linda at what looked like a wedding anniversary celebration. In one photo, Dad was wearing the same blue sweater that I remembered him wearing to my high school graduation, but in Linda's photo, he was wearing it to Michael's graduation party. There were vacation photos from Hawaii, Europe, and the Grand Canyon, places my father had never taken my mother and me, always claiming that we couldn't afford international travel or extended vacations. David told me his job required him to travel 3 weeks out of every month, Linda explained, her voice getting stronger as she began to understand the scope of his deception. He said he was based out of Portland and that he traveled to other states for work. "To me, you were the people he visited during business trips. I never suspected that he had another family." As Linda talked, the full horror of my father's deception became clear. It wasn't just that he had another wife and children. He had created an entirely separate identity, complete with different habits, different stories about his past, and different versions of major life events that I thought we had shared as a family. Linda knew nothing about my mother's battle with breast cancer 5 years earlier, the time that I thought had brought our family closer together as we supported her through chemotherapy and recovery. During those months when I thought my father was being especially loving and attentive, making extra trips home to help care for my mother, he was apparently telling his other family that he needed to travel more for work to cover for a colleague who was having personal problems. David was so stressed during that time, Linda said, unknowingly describing the same period when my mother was fighting cancer. He said work was overwhelming and that he was having to pick up extra responsibilities for a coworker who was dealing with family medical issues. He seemed so tired and worried, but he never wanted to talk about the details because he said it wasn't his place to share someone else's private problems. Even more disturbing, Linda's children had college funds that had been established years before I started college, and their family had financial security that we had never experienced. While my mother and I had always worried about money and I had taken out student loans to pay for my education, my father had apparently been living a much more comfortable lifestyle with his other family. Linda showed us photos of family vacations to Europe, Hawaii, and other destinations that my father had never taken us to. There were pictures of him at Michael's high school graduation, at Jessica's prom, and at family celebrations that had happened during times when I thought he was working especially hard to provide for our family. I knew David traveled a lot for work, Linda continued, but when he was home, he was completely present. He never missed important events, he helped with homework every night, and he made sure we took nice family vacations every year. I thought we were lucky to have such a devoted husband and father. My mother sat in stunned silence, occasionally asking questions that Linda answered with details that made it clear she wasn't lying or confused. Linda knew my father's favorite foods, his political opinions, his sense of humor, and personal details that only someone who had lived with him for decades would know. But she also knew different things about him than we did, as if there had been two completely different versions of David Chen. David always said he wanted to retire early and buy a boat, Linda said. He talked about sailing around the Pacific Northwest and maybe eventually taking longer trips down the coast. Did he ever mention that to you? My mother shook her head. David was terrified of deep water. He never would have wanted a boat. He always said he preferred mountains to oceans and that the idea of being out of sight of land made him nervous. As we compared notes about the man we had both loved, it became clear that my father had not only been living two separate lives, but he had been two completely different people, adapting his personality, preferences, and dreams to fit what each family needed from him. Over the next several hours, Linda, my mother, and I began the devastating process of comparing our memories and trying to understand how one person could have maintained such an elaborate deception for over 2 decades. What we discovered was a level of planning and organization that seemed almost superhuman in its complexity and attention to detail. Linda brought bank statements, insurance policies, and financial documents that revealed David had been much wealthier than my mother and I had ever known. While we had always lived modestly and worried about money, he had apparently been earning significantly more than he told us and using that income to support a more luxurious lifestyle with his other family. David always handled our finances, my mother said quietly, realizing for the first time how little she had actually known about their financial situation. He said he wanted to protect me from worrying about money, so he took care of all the bills and investments. I had access to our checking account for household expenses, but he managed everything else. Linda's family lived in a beautiful 4-bedroom house in an upscale Portland neighborhood, while my mother and I lived in a modest 3-bedroom ranch house that was nice but certainly not luxurious. Linda's children had attended private schools and summer camps, while I had attended public school and worked part-time jobs during high school to save money for college. I never understood why David was so conservative about spending, Linda said, looking at photos of our house that my mother had shown her. He always wanted to make sure we were financially secure, but he wasn't tight with money. We took nice vacations, the kids had everything they needed, and we never really worried about whether we could afford something we wanted. The geographic logistics of David's deception were staggering. Portland and Seattle are only 3 hours apart by car, close enough that he could easily travel between the two cities, but far enough apart that the chances of his two families accidentally encountering each other were minimal. He had somehow managed to maintain consistent schedules with both families, attending important events for both sets of children, and providing emotional support to both wives during difficult times. Linda showed us David's calendar from the previous year, which he had kept meticulous track of in a day planner that she had found in his home office. Every day was accounted for, with color-coded entries that indicated which family he was with and what his cover story was for the other family. Green entries were days he spent with Linda's family, blue entries were days he spent with us, and red entries were actual work obligations. David was incredibly organized, Linda explained, showing us how he had coordinated holidays, birthdays, and special events so that he could be present for both families without either of us becoming suspicious about his absences. He never forgot anything important, and he always seemed to know exactly where he needed to be. During Christmas 2019, for example, David had celebrated with Linda's family on Christmas Eve, driven to Seattle on Christmas morning to celebrate with us, and returned to Portland on December 26th, telling Linda that he had been required to work Christmas Day because of an emergency at one of his client hospitals. "I remember that Christmas," I said, feeling sick as I realized how carefully orchestrated our holiday had been. Dad seemed a little tired and distracted, but he said he had been working extra hours to make sure he could have Christmas Day off to spend with us. I thought it was sweet that he had made such an effort to be home for the holiday. Linda and my mother compared notes about David's travel patterns, and they realized that his supposed work schedule had been carefully designed to allow him to maintain both relationships. When he told my mother he was traveling to Portland for business, he was actually going home to his other family. When he told Linda he was traveling to Seattle for work, he was actually coming home to us. "David always called me at exactly 7 p.m. when he was traveling," Linda said. "He said it was the only time he could guarantee privacy because he would be back in his hotel room after dinner. I thought it was romantic that he was so consistent about staying in touch." My mother and I looked at each other in shock. "He called us at 7 p.m. too," my mother said. "Every single night when he was traveling, he would call to check in and ask about our days. I thought it showed how much he cared about staying connected even when he was away." We realized that David had been making 2 phone calls every night when he was traveling, checking in with both families and maintaining emotional connections that made each wife feel like she was the center of his world. The logistics of this alone seemed impossible, but he had apparently managed it for years without either family becoming suspicious. Linda showed us photos of birthday parties and celebrations that had occurred on dates when I remembered my father being particularly stressed about work deadlines or travel complications. "David always made sure he was home for important events," Linda said. "He might have to leave early or arrive late sometimes because of work, but he never missed birthdays, graduations, or holidays." I remembered several occasions when my father had seemed rushed during family celebrations, arriving late or leaving earlier than expected because of what he said were work emergencies. Now I realized that those emergencies were probably events with his other family that he couldn't miss without arousing suspicion. The emotional coordination was perhaps even more complex than the logistical coordination. Linda described David's parenting style, his sense of humor, and his approach to marriage in ways that sounded exactly like the father and husband I had known, but she also described moments of stress and distraction that I now realized had probably been caused by the pressure of maintaining his double life. Sometimes David would seem overwhelmed, Linda admitted. He would get quiet and distant, like he had a lot on his mind but didn't want to talk about work stress. I always tried to give him space to decompress from his travel schedule. My mother nodded in recognition. David had those moods too. He would come home from business trips seeming exhausted in a way that went beyond just being tired from travel. I thought it was the pressure of his job, but now I wonder if it was the stress of keeping track of everything he was hiding from us. As we continued to piece together the timeline of David's double life, we discovered that he had been maintaining separate friendships, separate hobbies, and even separate healthcare providers in each city. He had essentially created 2 completely different versions of himself, each perfectly adapted to the expectations and needs of the family he was with. 2 days after Linda's initial visit, she returned to our house with her children, Michael and Jessica, so that both families could meet and try to understand how our lives had been so intricately connected without any of us knowing. The meeting was awkward, painful, and surreal in ways that I still struggle to describe. Michael was 22, tall and athletic with my father's dark hair and serious expression. He looked so much like the photos I had seen of my father at that age that it was startling. Jessica was 19, petite with long black hair and a shy smile that reminded me of myself at her age. Both of them seemed as confused and hurt as I was, trying to process the revelation that their father had been living a completely different life with people they had never heard of. "I keep trying to figure out if Dad ever slipped up," Michael said during that first meeting. "Did he ever mention names or places that didn't make sense? Did he ever seem like he was hiding something important? But I can't think of anything obvious. He just seemed like a normal dad who traveled a lot for work." Jessica was quieter, but when she did speak, her questions were heartbreaking. "Do you think he loved us as much as he loved you?" she asked me. "Did he ever talk about wanting other children, or did he seem satisfied with just having one daughter?" I didn't know how to answer questions that I was asking myself about my own relationship with our father. Had his love been divided between two families, or had he somehow been capable of loving all of us completely despite the deception? Had there been signs that he was hiding something this significant, or had he been such a skilled liar that even the people closest to him had never suspected? "Dad always seemed proud of us," Michael continued. "He came to my soccer games, helped me with college applications, and gave me advice about relationships and career choices. But now I keep wondering if he was comparing me to you, Sarah, or if he wished he could have had both families together for holidays and celebrations." Linda and my mother tried to facilitate conversations between all of us, but the emotional complexity was overwhelming. We were grieving the loss of a man we had loved while simultaneously discovering that our relationships with him had been built on lies. We were angry about the deception while also trying to honor the genuine love and care he had provided to all of us. "I found some of David's personal papers after his death," Linda said, showing us a journal that my father had apparently kept sporadically over the years. "I thought you might want to see what he wrote about both families. Maybe it will help us understand what he was thinking." The journal entries were devastating to read. In them, my father wrote about the stress of maintaining his double life, his love for both families, and his constant fear of being discovered. He wrote about feeling trapped by his own deception but not knowing how to resolve the situation without destroying both families. One entry from 2018 read, "Sarah graduated from college today. I'm so proud of the woman she's become, but I couldn't help thinking about Michael's graduation next year and how I won't be able to share my pride in both of my children with anyone who would understand. I love both my families completely, but I've created a situation where that love has to be divided and hidden. I don't know how to fix what I've done without hurting everyone I care about." Another entry from 2020 read, "Linda has been talking about our retirement plans, and Susan mentioned wanting to travel more once Sarah is completely independent. I realize that as my families get older and their expectations change, it's going to become harder and harder to maintain this balance. Sometimes I think about telling them both the truth, but I can't imagine any scenario where that doesn't destroy their lives and their trust in everything they've believed about our relationships." Reading my father's own words about his deception was heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. He clearly understood that he was hurting all of us, but he had continued the lies for decades rather than finding a way to be honest about what he had created. "I think Dad was planning to tell us eventually," Jessica said after we had read several entries. "It sounds like he knew he couldn't keep this up forever, but he couldn't figure out how to do it without hurting everyone." "But that's what makes me angry," I replied. "He had years to figure out how to be honest. Instead, he chose to let all of us live in a lie rather than dealing with the consequences of what he had done. We deserve to know the truth about our own lives." My mother had been mostly quiet during our family meetings, but finally she spoke up about how she was processing the discovery. "I keep going through our entire marriage trying to figure out what was real and what was performance," she said. "Did David actually love me, or was I just convenient for the life he wanted to maintain in Seattle? When he said he missed us during his business trips, was that true, or was he actually happy to be away from the stress of pretending to be someone he wasn't?" Linda nodded in understanding. "I have the same questions. David seemed like such a genuine person, but how can someone be genuine when their entire life is based on deception? I believed everything he told me about his past, his dreams, and his feelings for our family. Now I don't know what was true and what was just another layer of his lies." The financial complications were enormous and required legal intervention to resolve. David had apparently maintained separate wills for each family, separate insurance policies, and separate financial arrangements that created conflicts between his two families over his estate, his belongings, and even his funeral arrangements. Neither family felt like we had the right to make decisions about a man who had deceived us both so completely. Linda's children wanted to attend memorial services, but my mother felt like their presence would make the loss even more painful by reminding everyone of David's betrayal. We ended up having separate memorial services, which felt wrong but was the only way to handle a situation that David's deception had made impossible to navigate normally. "I keep thinking about all the family photos we have," Michael said during one of our meetings. "In every picture, Dad looks happy and relaxed, like he's exactly where he wants to be. But now I know that in half of those photos, he was probably thinking about his other family and when he would see them next." The legal settlement took months to resolve, with lawyers helping both families understand their rights to David's estate and insurance benefits. Throughout this process, Linda and I maintained contact, trying to understand how our father had managed such an elaborate deception and whether there were things we could learn from each other about who he really was. 6 months after Linda first contacted us, our investigation into my father's double life revealed layers of deception that went far beyond maintaining two families. As we dug deeper into his financial records, personal belongings, and digital footprint, we discovered that David Chen had been living an even more complex web of lies than any of us had initially realized. While going through David's home office in the Portland house, Linda found a safety deposit box key that led to discoveries that shocked both families. The box contained documents for a third bank account that neither family had known about, containing over $400,000 in savings that he had accumulated over the years. There were also legal documents for a small cabin in the mountains of Northern California that he had apparently owned for over 10 years. I found rental agreements showing that David had been renting out this cabin to vacation travelers. Linda explained during one of our weekly phone calls that had become routine as we continued to uncover the scope of his deception. The rental income was going into that separate bank account, and he had been managing the property remotely. Neither of our families ever knew about it. The mountain cabin raised new questions about how David had been spending his time and whether there were other aspects of his life that remained hidden from both families. My mother and I drove to the cabin, which was about 4 hours from Seattle, and found a beautiful, well-maintained property that looked like it had been regularly used and cared for. Inside the cabin, we found photo albums and personal items that suggested David had spent significant time there alone, possibly using it as a retreat where he could escape from the pressure of maintaining his double life. There were books about psychology and stress management, journals that described his internal struggles with his deception, and evidence that he had been seeing a therapist in Sacramento under an assumed name. The therapist records we found show that David had been getting counseling for anxiety and depression related to what he described as complex family obligations, I told Linda during our investigation. He never told the therapist the whole truth about his situation, but he was clearly struggling with the psychological pressure of maintaining his lies. Linda and I decided to visit the therapist together to see if we could learn more about David's mental state during the last few years of his life. Dr. Rebecca Morrison had been seeing David quarterly for 3 years, and she agreed to meet with us after we provided documentation proving our relationship to him and explaining our need to understand his psychological condition. David presented as someone carrying an enormous emotional burden, Dr. Morrison explained during our session. He talked about feeling trapped by obligations that he couldn't explain in detail, and he struggled with anxiety that seemed to be related to fear of disappointing people who depended on him. He never revealed the specific nature of his situation, but it was clear that he was living with significant psychological stress. Dr. Morrison's notes revealed that David had been researching ways to reduce his anxiety without making major life changes that would affect his family obligations. He had apparently been looking for therapeutic techniques that would help him manage the stress of his situation without requiring him to address the fundamental dishonesty that was causing his psychological problems. David was intelligent and self-aware enough to understand that his anxiety was related to his life choices, Dr. Morrison continued, but he seemed to believe that making changes to resolve the underlying issues would cause more harm than continuing to manage the symptoms. He was essentially trying to find ways to live with the consequences of decisions he felt he couldn't undo. As Linda and I continued our investigation, we discovered that David had been maintaining not just two families, but essentially three separate identities. In addition to David Chen in Seattle and David Martinez in Portland, he had been David Cheng in Sacramento, where he had established the therapist relationship, maintained the mountain cabin, and apparently had a small circle of acquaintances who knew him as a divorced businessman who traveled frequently for work. I found emails between David and people in Sacramento who seemed to consider him a friend, Linda discovered while going through his digital accounts. They invited him to social events, shared personal problems with him, and treated him like someone they had known for years. He had apparently created an entire third social network around his retreat cabin. The Sacramento identity seemed to be where David went when he needed a break from the pressure of maintaining his two family lives. According to the people we contacted, David Cheng was a quiet, thoughtful man who enjoyed hiking, reading, and philosophical conversations about life and relationships. He had told them that he had been divorced for several years and that his work required extensive travel that made serious relationships difficult. It's like he created a third version of himself that was closer to who he really was, I told my mother after learning about the Sacramento connections. With us, he was the devoted family man. With Linda's family, he was the successful provider. But in Sacramento, he seemed to be someone who was struggling with complex personal issues and looking for ways to understand himself. This discovery raised new questions about whether David had been planning to eventually leave both families and start over with a completely new identity in Sacramento. The cabin was large enough to live in year-round, and his therapist notes suggested that he had been considering major life changes that would allow him to live more authentically. Linda and I spent weeks trying to piece together the timeline of David's various identities and understand how he had managed to maintain friendships and business relationships in three different cities while keeping all of these social networks completely separate from each other. I think the Sacramento identity was David's way of trying to figure out who he really was underneath all the lies, Linda said during one of our conversations. Maybe he was planning to eventually tell both of our families the truth and then disappear to start over where no one knew about his deception. But the most disturbing discovery came when we found evidence that David might not have been the only one living a double life. Among his papers, we found correspondence with other men who seemed to be sharing advice about maintaining complex personal situations involving multiple families and identities. David was apparently part of some kind of informal support network for men who were living similar double lives. I explained to my mother after Linda and I had discovered several email threads discussing strategies for managing travel schedules, financial arrangements, and emotional relationships with multiple families. The emails suggested that David's situation wasn't as unique as we had initially thought, and that there were other men who had created similar elaborate deceptions to maintain relationships with multiple families simultaneously. The correspondence included practical advice about logistics, emotional support during stressful periods, and discussions about the psychological toll of living with such complex deceptions. I can't decide if knowing that other people were doing this makes David's behavior more understandable or more disturbing, Linda said when we discussed this discovery. On one hand, it shows that he wasn't a complete sociopath who invented this situation from scratch. On the other hand, it means there are other families out there who might be living in similar lives without knowing it. Reading David's correspondence with these other men provided insight into his mindset during the final years of his life. He wrote about feeling increasingly trapped by his situation, worrying about the impact his deception would have on his children if discovered, and struggling with guilt about the resources and emotional energy he was taking away from both families by dividing his attention. In his final email to the group, sent just 2 weeks before his death, David wrote, "I think I'm finally ready to tell both families the truth. I can't continue living this way, and they deserve to know who they've really been sharing their lives with. I'm planning to have conversations with both families after the holidays. I just hope they can eventually forgive me for the years of lies." David's death had prevented him from having those conversations, leaving both families to discover his deception in the most shocking and painful way possible. But knowing that he had been planning to tell us the truth provided some small comfort that he had recognized the harm his lies were causing and was finally ready to face the consequences of his choices. Today, 2 years after David's death, Linda and I have maintained a close friendship based on our shared experience of discovering that someone we loved had been living such an elaborate lie. Both of our families have found ways to move forward while accepting that we will never fully understand how someone could maintain such complex deceptions for so many years. My mother has started dating again, but she struggles with trust issues that stem from learning that the person she thought she knew better than anyone had been hiding such fundamental truths about his life. Linda has also begun new relationships, but both of our mothers approach dating with a level of caution that they never had before David's betrayal. Michael and Jessica have become like siblings to me, and we support each other as we navigate the complex emotions of loving someone who caused us so much pain through his deception. We've learned that it's possible to miss someone while also being angry at them, and that grief becomes more complicated when it's mixed with betrayal and disappointment. If you've discovered that someone you trusted was hiding major secrets from you, please know that you're not alone and that healing is possible even when the truth is more shocking than anything you could have imagined. The process of rebuilding trust in yourself and others takes time, but it is possible to move forward while honoring both the love you felt and the pain you experienced.